Welcome everybody, good evening. Welcome to the Race Equality Lecture Series here at Keele University. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Udeni Salmon. I'm a Research Associate here at Keele Management School. I'm also a member of the Race Equality Charter Committee here at the University of Keele. So we signed up for the Equality Challenge Unit's Race Equality Charter for higher education institutions last year, and we are engaging in a process whereby we critically reflect on the extent to which we as an institution are part of a racially unequal world. So I would like to thank the Race Equality Charter Committee for their funding of this lecture series. If you have any suggestions for who we can invite next year, please do let me know. Email me or just speak to me afterwards. We'd like to get a much more kind of wider involvement and engagement in the lecture series. So as part of the series, we've invited leading writers and activists on anti-racism to share their experiences with our staff, our students and the wider public. We've had 12 lectures this year. This is the last one, with about 700 people in attendance over the year. I can safely say that our objective of trying to connect staff and students and the public in a common project of learning more about racism has been achieved. So our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Muzamil Qureshi, Senior Lecturer in Criminology and Criminal Justice from the University of Salford. Muzamil is the author of numerous texts on Muslim prison populations with regarding to offending and victimisation. His research interests include religion and ethnicity in prison, colonialism and comparative criminology. His methodological leanings are towards qualitative ethnographic research informed by the critical race theory perspective. His work includes collaborative criminological research in Malaysia, examining crimes of apostasy, rehabilitation detention centres and the treatment of sexual offenders. He convenes and teaches on topics such as criminal justice and human rights, intersectionality and crime, ethnicity and race, and criminological theory. The title of Muzamil's lecture is Racism, Risks and Roles, the Methodological Challenges of Researching Muslim Prisoners. He will examine the key conceptual and methodological challenges to undertaking research with Muslim prisoners and also cover issues specific to prison research methods in relation to the roles of intersectionality, biography, and how to negotiate a role in qualitative research on racism. His talk will also introduce a major forthcoming study at SOAS on conversion to Islam in prison, for which Muzamil is a co-investigator. So this is his book for anyone who would like a really great textbook on researching racism. This is available through Sage Publishers. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Muzamil Qureshi. Please give him a very warm Keele welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks to Dr. Salmon for inviting me. Thanks to Keele University, and thank you to you as well, giving up a lovely evening to come and speak to me. I hope that it's engaging for you. As has been mentioned, there are a number of key themes to the talk, but given the numbers we have here as well today, maybe we have more interaction as well in terms of specific issues which may be of concern to you in your respective research. Again, this is terribly egotistical, but it's not for that reason I've put this slide up. These are some publications, but to give you some orientation in terms of the fact that criminology is a multidisciplinary topic, and therefore I straddle a number of different themes in terms of discipline and of interest. So my publications tend to be on Muslim populations, both as perpetrators and victims of crime, but also this necessarily involves engagement with questions around identity, around theology, around human rights. So there are a number of different publications there which relate to my work at the confluence of issues affecting Muslim populations. And we'll come to talk a little bit about the intersectional approach, which also informs my work and a lot of research that's going on in race and counter-race or anti-racism research. The core of what I want to speak about today comes from my focused ethnographic research on the first major examination of Muslim prisoners in the UK and France. And that was some time ago, as you can see, 2000, 2002. However, there's been no substantial study since that date until the one that I've just started, which is going to come. So it's quite a neat time to come and join and speak to you about this. So that project, the original Muslims project, Muslim Prisoners Project, was an ESRC-funded study that looked at the qualitative experiences of Muslim prisoners in 3 UK prisons and 4 French prisons. Now, my French is terrible. Like Udeni, I did Russian at school. French was terrible. So we had a French team. I did all of the UK research for all the prisons and spent nearly a year in 3 different prisons. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, about the challenges, about the excitement, but also some of the considerations that researchers, criminologists have to take into mind and plan for before they step foot in a prison. And just recently, as was mentioned during the introduction, I've been successful with a colleague at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, Dr. Matthew Wilkinson, who is funded by the Doors Trust, which is a charity which looks at ex-offenders and to try and prevent recidivism with ex-offenders. And we have a 5-year study looking at conversion to Islam in prison. And we're looking at 7 prisons in the UK and 4 prisons in Switzerland and France also. So I'll talk a little bit about that because literally today and yesterday I was filling a 47-page application, which is the prison service IRAS form that you have to complete to go in. So it's very much fresh in my mind. I'm going to talk about this population of people in prison and its significance for broader themes and arguments and discussions around criminal justice and society. I'm going to unpack somewhat the ethnicity and crime debate, and immediately some of you will know what that debate is. Some may not know. We'll talk a little bit about what the terms of that debate are based on, how the debate is framed. Of course, methodology and ethics, and look at particularly the Muslim population in prison, why it's of concern, why it's of interest to me, why it's of interest to a number of researchers, and also the red herring somewhat at the end, Islamic radicalization in prison. So I put question mark because researchers who are working in this field are far more muted in their evidence or observations of whether prisons are somehow conveyor belts for radicalization. So we'll talk about some of the contrast between government rhetoric and policy rhetoric and academic research, which is finding a more nuanced interpretation of what it means to have a faith identity in prison and to spend their time in prison and coming out of prison. And hopefully, I've been told I've got about 50 minutes, so I'll try and keep to time and allow some opportunities for questions and answers. But please do feel free to ask. We're considerable, at this size of group. You can raise your hands if there's something you want to have further clarification on. So, apologies for stats. Having said I'm a qualitative researcher, I've now got some statistics. I don't want you to be bamboozled by these because there's a reason behind them. There's a reason behind starting with statistics. And the first thing I want to raise here is that we have Muslims in the census, are about 2.7 million Muslims in the UK. Okay? And it's the second largest population, religious population, after Christianity. Okay, so it's only about 5% of the UK. And what we find is it's the South Asian Muslim population, which is the largest Muslim ethnic group. Okay, so the public face of Islam in Britain is largely South Asian. That means Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi. So majority of people who are Pakistani also affiliate to Islam. Majority of people from Bangladesh also affiliate, but not exclusively, to Islam, and a third of Indians also are Muslims as well. So those groups, through the diaspora and through migration, have influenced Islam and the interpretation of Islam within the UK. And in prison, there's significant variation, though, of ethnicity within the prison estate. So what we've got already, I'm throwing some terms at you in terms of we've got religious identity and we've got ethnicity and we've got nationality as well. And some of these things, some of these categories are unhelpful because they're conflated. And you'll get statistics which are presented at different points of the criminal justice system in different ways. But what we see from that first slide is that we have a marginal overrepresentation of Asians, and Asians, we've said, are the public face of Islam. So that's the first thing to take away, and we see that black population is significantly overrepresented in prison stats, which is a consistent trend from the decades that it's been monitored. But in prison, we have a very a historic reference point for collecting information on religion, because the Prison Act 1952 makes it the law to record religious affiliation. Okay, so that predates race, ethnicity, all those issues. So we've got quite a robust record, and we see that the Muslim population has experienced a rapid increase. So the headline to take away, and by the way, I'll make these slides available to you via Udemy as well, is that we've got 7% of the male prison population in 2001 were Muslim, and as of 2016, that's gone up to 15%. So there is a significant overrepresentation of Muslim males in UK prisons proportionate to the population density of Muslims. The Home Office have only released ethnicity matched to religion on one occasion in 2001. And that reveals something quite interesting, that there's a number of black Muslims in prison, and the black Muslim prison population is significantly overrepresented. And what's accounting for that? Conversion. So what we see is that in the census, there's only 10% of the UK who've declared Islam as their faith and represent a black ethnicity. But there's up to 34% of the Muslim prison population who are black. Okay? So that's the evidence. And these stats are only significant in relationship to what I call a 100% measure. That I'm not really interested in the figures. I'm interested in what they're telling us about the processes. What is interesting about this is that what's going on, the dynamics in terms of people who are entering the criminal justice system, because the prison population is the end point. You may argue, of course, we've got resettlement and rehabilitation, but it marks a stage, a formal stage in the criminal justice process. And that's telling us something. So it's attracted significant research interest. And this is the ethnicity and crime debate. So I've already started to kind of untap this somewhat, or unpick it. But we have had a persistent overrepresentation of black and minority ethnic populations in the official crime statistics since they began. Okay? Now, and that trend has remained more or less consistent, and it's not just in Britain, in fact, it's in a lot of Western industrialized nations, also across the pond there in America. So we've got two stances here. I was in France last year and Italy earlier this year, and you'll find that, of course, not all constitutions and not all countries record the ethnicity of people, or certainly the religion of people in prison. So if I went over to Denmark, for example, and asked them, can I get your stats on how many Muslim prisoners you've got, what do you think the response would be? Would they be able to provide me with those statistics? They can't. Sweden? They can't. France? They can't. And why can't they provide us with those statistics, do you think?
Do they record them?
Why don't they record them, though?
Do they conflate it with religion? You're saying ethnicity and religious faith is combined?
It's actually against the Constitution to ask somebody of their faith. The reason being, because of the Nazi dominance. The Nazis went straight to parish records and find out who was who, including Jewish populations. So there is a constitutional objection to the formal recording of religion, which we don't have in Britain. We've not had that. So actually, we've got a record, and there's two sides to this, of course. Should we record crimes matched against ethnicity or faith? On the no side, well, this fuels stereotypes. It reifies, the connections between ethnicity and deviance. That's one of the negative consequences. But there's also a positive side. And the positive side is that it may indicate discrimination and disproportionate treatment in the criminal justice system. And therefore, it directs policies, training, and the deployment of resources. I mean, on a balance of the balance of this question, really, or the outcome of the question, I think I will side with the right, that yes, because does it mean that in those countries where they don't record religion or ethnicity that racism or discrimination is absent? Absolutely not. In fact, do they not need resources in those countries? Absolutely. I've been to many conferences where I've had chaplains raising their hand and saying, actually, we need to cater for our Muslim prisoners. I can't tell you formally how many there are, but I know there are, in my prison at least, X amount. So in a way it leads to an absurd outcome in terms of those countries have to cater for the religious needs of their prisoners, but they don't have any hard data on the population. So that's one of the flip sides. Now, these rising number of prisoners who are Muslim does present the prisoner state with a number of challenges. I'm a lawyer. My first degree was in law, and it's curious that if you were to, God forbid, after leaving this talk today, pursued by the police, something wrong with your car, okay, and you're a bit angry for whatever reason, you get stopped, and let's just say the encounter doesn't go well, and you find yourself on a remand wing in HMP Birmingham, Winson Green. And thankfully, hopefully, that's a very unlikely outcome, but it could happen, depending on who you are and where you are. Well, once you enter that prisoner state, there's a whole layer of rules and regulations that govern that prison, and it's done through secondary legislation, through prison service orders. It's effectively a legal system that's operating that only applies to the prisoner state. But nevertheless, there are real consequences to breaches of the prison service orders. I'd say a parallel would be like a code. So a code itself, if you breach a code, is not necessarily an infraction of the law, but it's persuasive as an indication of negligence. And also, a breach of certain rules in prison could add time to your sentence, and also deal with different categories in terms of your privileges. So the incentives and earned privileges scheme is based on a form of reward and punishment. So some of you may know about that system. I can talk a little bit about it later. So there is a PSO, Prison Service Order, that deals with religious provision. It's now folded into a general diversity policy. So there is a code, there is a codification of what it means to be a prisoner and what rights you've got in prison. In fact, what rights do you think prisoners have compared to you and I? What rights?
Can they vote?
Can they vote? They can't vote. Any rights they've got? What other rights have they got?
Right to safety.
Right to safety, okay. It's a bit of a trick question. The answer is they have all the rights that you and I have, apart from two categories. Okay? Two categories. Rights which are specifically legislated against. So Parliament has said, Parliament Act, there's always discussion about whether they should be given the right to vote or not, and suffrage. So that's one of the rights where Parliament has specifically said they're not allowed to vote. The second category is rights which are inconsistent with their condition of incarceration. So it would be absurd for me to say that my freedom of movement is restricted because I'm in a cell. Of course, that's a condition of your incarceration. But guess what? Every other right they share with you and I. And that's correct, because the main orientation, the main aim for prison is rehabilitation. And their punishment is to be segregated from mainstream society, be withheld from mainstream society and free mixing. That's the punitive element of it. So it comes down to this issue where I was very interested in the prison service orders, and particularly the religious provision, because these are the points of conflict in terms of prisoners articulating their rights, their religious rights, and the prison service interpreting how they are to discharge these day-to-day issues. So we've got the practical issues of diet, of prayer facilities, of ablution, of texts. Texts in particular are controversial. Are particular texts to be prohibited? Are they inflammatory? Are they extremist? Have you the ability to vet these texts? Association, which is the mixing, free mixing and within the prison estate, and congregational prayers. So there's an obligation for Muslims to pray in congregation at least once a week. And Ramadan, it's just ended. How do those particular religious rights, how do they present the prison service with particular challenges? And those of you who've been researching and are very familiar with the prison literature in terms of the pains of imprisonment and the disciplinary nature of prison, you'll find that prisons supposed to run, although recently there's all sorts of problems going on, in terms of a regularity. You know, in terms of the Foucauldian carceral continuum, is that we've got this perpetual factory-like environment that runs to time and unlocked at particular times. And how do these religious rights, therefore, and these exceptions largely, cause a problem for prison governors? Issues around funding. Who pays for this? Are certain rights more expensive to be discharged by the prison estate? What about sacred space? I was very impressed coming in today and seeing the fireplace there with your motto. You know, so the issue is that prisons also have sacred spaces. Religion, particularly the Church of England, the Anglican Church, ecclesiastical philosophies underpin contemporary penology. And you'll find the Victorian period, many of the prisons were built around chapels. Those chapels are sacred, consecrated, sacred spaces. And what about allowing members of other faith groups to pray there? Is it an insult? What about staff, the training of staff? What about proselytizing? So one of the most dominant groups in the UK is called the Tabligh Jamaat, and their mission is it's a South Asian seminary, and they're the revivalists. They're known as revivalists, and their mode is quite evangelical amongst Muslims. So they'll go to Muslim households and say, "Come to the mosque, pray." Okay, but proselytizing is illegal in prison. I cannot bring people to my faith. I can't preach to convert. It's actually illegal in prison. So how do those faiths, where there is actually an evangelical mission, operate? How are they muted in the prison setting? How are those people who are responsible for discharging pastoral religious duties vetted for their inclusiveness, their tolerance, their education, their knowledge of Islam? All these things coalesce with the tensions around securitization of Muslim prisoners. Also, I'm stood today, I've not shaved, so apologies, but guess what? I can shave if I want. And you might think that's a bit of an absurd thing to say. But actually, in terms of religious interpretation, Islam is pluralistic. We have different schools of thought as to whether certain practices are permissible or not, whether they are prohibited, whether they're permissible, whether they're discouraged or encouraged. And I can choose from a wide pluralistic source of jurisprudence and say, if it is a sin, I will repent, I will pray for that, but I have the choice. But the law in prison is the same whether you enter HMP Manchester or whether you enter HMP Winson Green, Birmingham. It has to be the same in the UK, in England and Wales, certainly. So the pluralism is somewhat lost to a degree because somebody's made a decision on my behalf before I've entered that prison as to how my religion is to be interpreted. And I'll talk a little bit about who that person is, how it happens. Are policies adequate for these diverse intersections between individuals who are both identified often as ethnic minorities, but also religious minorities? And are the current policies and the way in which the census and formal government documents record ethnicity adequate? The other issue is about gangs. There's a lot of rhetoric around people being converted and forced to convert. What about those challenges? And radicalisation and extremism, which is of interest to me, but I put it deliberately down the bottom because actually it's somewhat the least interesting in terms of the ethnographic research. But also the tension between spiritual enlightenment and a secular skepticism. What I mean here is that all faith groups are arguably marginalised within a secular worldview. And, if somebody comes to faith in prison, it is not, hallelujah, I've seen the light, and therefore I am rehabilitated. Okay? So how are those people who come to faith treated by their formal supervisors in terms of rehabilitation and how they progress in a sentence? And that sentence is largely something that is secular, although the latest HMPSS code is acknowledging faith as a potentially pro-social factor. So it's the first time they've ever acknowledged that. Okay, so I want to open this up a little bit to the floor because it's about methodology. But so imagine you're joining me on this. We've just recruited a postdoc, so sorry about that, but on quite a good salary, 47,000. So if you were joining me on this current project, what would be your key priorities methodologically from the outset? What sort of issues do you think we would face immediately? What are the first things that we would have to think about in undertaking our research in a prison setting? Yeah? Access, yeah, absolutely. It's the first thing there. So, and this is a laborious process, actually. It can take many, many months. In the Warwick study, it took 4 months, but we also were refused prisons that we wanted to go into. So one of the prisons had a notorious, I can't name the prison, but it had a notoriety for poor race relations. And it had been the subject of previous research also by a number of criminologists. We wanted to go into that prison and we were refused because the prison service were quite rightly, probably, but I think they were obstructive in allowing us to go there. But we negotiated and we managed to get into that prison. And I'll talk about it later, but it's a prison that I was racially abused in fact, as a researcher. Access is at multiple strands. We have access to the overall project. We have access to the day-to-day as well. And that access is very temporary in a way because events happen which mean your access can be completely suspended. Okay? And this relates to the second one. Gatekeepers are particular people that you need to get approval from and to explain your research to as well. And these gatekeepers, again, there's a multiple hierarchy of who they are, both from governor number one to the day-to-day governors to people who are simply working in the chaplaincy or the team that come to unlock the door and meet you as well. So you've got those people to work with. Qualitative versus quantitative research. So have we got any quantitative researchers in the room? Yeah, quite a few. So, of course, there are benefits to both perspectives, but they answer different questions. One of the challenges to quantitative research is a major challenge to quantitative research in prison contexts. What do you think that is? How would you normally do your quantitative research? Data sets. And where would you get your information from? Surveys. So part of the problem is the average reading age is 11 in England and Wales, amongst the male population estate, the prison estate. You also have to physically go in and collect numbers of surveys and go to various sites to do that. Having said that, as I'll talk about hopefully in the Q&A, we are doing a mixed methods project for the current project as well. In the case of the Warwick study, it was a qualitative study, and partly because we didn't know much about this population to start with, so it was exploratory in terms of trying to find out what those experiences were, and the focus was on experiential, which I think is quite important for unlocking issues around culture and religion and experience of discrimination. What's very important was the team that we had on the project, and the influence of a person's biography on the research environment. And I had a very good friend at the time I was doing my PhD, who was a plant biologist, and we used to meet up on the end of the day after our work and go for a walk. And on one of these days, we would talk about our own problems we were facing in our respective PhDs. And one day I was going through with him talking about my PhD, and he said, "You're the worst person to be doing that research." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you're a Muslim, and therefore you're biased, aren't you?" So I said, interesting. So who is less biased? Who will come to this with a different perspective? And you're assuming somebody who isn't Muslim will somehow be neutral, operates in this kind of neutrality. I said, I am the phenomenon. I don't have to become the phenomenon. When I entered prison and performed ablution to pray, I can empathize with those prisoners because I'm doing it. When I stand there in prayer in the chapel, I am with them in congregation. When they talk to me about missing key cultural events, I've missed those cultural events with them. So there are pluses and minuses. Your biography enables, it also limits. It's being aware that what those limitations are, what those benefits are, and also being completely transparent about them. Declare those in your writing and in terms of how the biography enabled a certain interaction, but also limited interaction, how you are viewed by individuals in the particular field that you're working in. I'm sure my biography also distanced me from a number of white officers who were there in the prison, and I interviewed them as well. We had to do covert research in France. So that research straddled 9/11. I was actually in prison on 9/11, 2001, and I was called over to a prison officer's cell, a prison officer's office on the wing, and he had a black and white TV there. And it was actually the images of the planes that were attacking the Pentagon. They were the first images I saw. And thereafter, everything changed. The attitude towards our project changed. Our research team in France comprised of 3 individuals: a professor of Iranian origin, but French national, a Moroccan researcher, French national, and a female white German researcher. The 2 Muslims were thrown out of prison following 9/11 without any explanation. We had to negotiate to get them back in. In France, we did not declare that we were looking at human rights issues or indeed researching the experiences of Muslim prisoners. We talked about conflict in poetry, and we talked to people about poetry. Then we got talking about their lived experiences because there was no platform. So it's covert research in France, and it raises ethical issues. And would the research be done again? We're not sure. I think we're going through a similar process at the moment. We use semi-structured interviews, and our sampling was essentially focusing on those purposive sampling and snowballing sampling, because you enter a particular prison and you have to build rapport with prisoners, spending a long time observing prayers, seeing people on the wings, in association, in work, and slowly you start to actually build up rapport and invite individuals for interview. Ethics, lots of issues I'm sure you can think of. I'm going to run through some of those. Of course, data protection, these are on all research that you do. Informed consent. So what kind of consent would you recommend? Well, let's have a look about, everybody has to deal with informed consent, but anonymity is a problem in prison. So would I give absolute confidentiality and anonymity to my respondents, do you think, in prison? Are we not supposed to do that as ethical researchers and say, you know, everything you say will be confidential, your name won't be released? Are there problems with that approach in the prison setting? What do you think?
So you mean giving confidentiality no matter what you say to them?
Absolute confidentiality, yeah.
Okay, so if you say, I'm guilty of that crime, but
Yeah.
right, so obviously you can't do that.
You can't do it, no. It's conditional. Okay, so the British Society of Criminology Code of Ethics does guide us that it's conditional, and you have to inform the respondent that providing you don't tell me information that will bring others to harm or yourself to harm, then it will remain confidential. Unfortunately, on 2 occasions I had to report an incident. Even though I knew it wasn't going to come to something, there was one chap who had converted to Islam. He was a loyalist paramilitary member, and in the middle of the interview, he simply came out that he was going to blow up the officers' the mess. And so I had to stop the interview. And I knew it was pure venting of frustration, because there were no officers' messes. He'd been in prison so long, he didn't know they'd closed down many years before. Nevertheless, it was his intention. So he was reported on, and that was a difficult ethical challenge, actually, for researchers as well, to say, actually, I want information from you, but also you could also end up in a worse position from talking to me, because now you've got an extra security focus. And that's the issues. But of course, this last one is a very important issue, which is the risk of prison-based research. There are presentational risks to being in prison. And I mentioned I was racially abused by an officer in one of the prisons, simply for sitting there and waiting for my respondent, and he asked me what I was doing, and I said, I'm doing research on Muslim prisoners, and that was the ignition to a rant, a racist rant. He left his position and walked and left me in the chapel. And this person said that he'd never go on race relations training, that England was for white people, and that things had gone terribly wrong, and that he'd been there, and essentially that he had no respect whatsoever for human rights or the research that was being undertaken. I also witnessed, yes?
Sorry, can I come back to your ethics
Yes.
question? Surely a person of that attitude potentially represents a danger to prisoner.
Oh, yes.
Are you under any obligation to report?
I'd say that with hindsight, yeah, I'd say with hindsight, as a more mature person now and not a postdoc when I was doing that research, I think I would have done. At the time, I didn't report it. At the time, it's reported in terms of its essence. It gave added context to the reports of discrimination that I was hearing from the mouths of the prisoners. So it added to that in that sense that there is an officer willing to racially abuse or be extreme in the presence of a visitor. There was another incident in that prison where I was sat to be collected by the prison staff. The chaplains were going to come and collect me. And 2 officers were leaving. One officer was escorting them. From the interactionists in the room would probably work this out differently, but I assumed that 2 of them who were visiting, they had half uniforms on. So they didn't have the ties on, but they had their jackets on and their white shirts and trousers. And a uniformed officer was escorting them out of the prison. One of them said to the officer who was escorting them, "What's it like around here?" To which he turned to me, I was sat there waiting, and he said, "It's okay, but you've got to watch out for and he used the racist expletive N-word, "on your way out." That's what he said to me. So, and I could have been anybody. I could have been a volunteer who's coming in. I could have been some form of a governor or grade or imam or whoever. And he did this without batting an eyelid. So again, it told you more about the context of that particular prison. But I'm glad you raised that point, because I have a tutee who's just completed a PhD on the Borstals in Nigeria. She's examined 3 Borstals in Nigeria. And when we were guiding her on ethical procedure, we insisted that if she was to reveal explicit abuse or at the hands of the warders there, she would have to report it, and she did. So I think that on that occasion, I let it go, but it got reported back in terms of the report and not an individual. But I can't name the prison, but let's just say this prison is notorious for this type of attitude that was there. Some key findings, because I'm coming up to my 5 minutes or so, yes? Okay, so key findings from the prison project Beckford et al., published in 2005. We did find evidence of discrimination, both from prison officers and cellmates, as contextual discrimination, from fellow prisoners. We find that discrimination was based on ethnicity, religion, and types of offence. So in prison we have a hierarchy of criminals, and we've got VP, vulnerable prisoners, and main prisoners. Vulnerable prisoners are often those who are sexual offenders, or they've been segregated in the prison because they may have a debt, or there may be a price on their head for some reason, some disagreement, or gang affiliation, for example. There's a lot of racist language that was used. There's obstruction, offensive behaviour from non-Muslim cellmates. Direct racism was actually quite rare as well, but there was disrespect of religious items. I recall a number of prisoners telling me that they'd put their Quran on a shelf, and there's an Islamic etiquette to revere the text and to put it above the waist. It's an Islamic etiquette, particularly amongst South Asians. It's not widespread in the Islamic world, but definitely in amongst South Asians, that they would put the book above your head out of respect. And in a number of incidents, the cellmate would put pornographic literature on top of the Quran. So it's a provocative act that is to say, it's seamless, I'm just using the shelf as well. But that would provoke individuals there as well. We also got discrimination from prison officers, racist language, dehumanizing practices, the strip search, the way in people were strip searched as well. Again, the use and rifling through religious texts as well. It was more subtle and indirect than direct. The discrimination can take many forms: access to particular jobs or denial of access to jobs, denial of access to washing facilities, for example, and a greater use of discipline as well. Lots of complaints around halal meat, whether it was authentic or not. And Ramadan itself was policed quite heavily in terms of who could or could not be on Ramadan. Lots of stereotypical interpretations of what it means to be Asian as submissive and black as aggressive in the prison setting. And of course, 9/11, Muslims were viewed with increasing suspicion as well. These findings have been mirrored by Her Majesty's Inspectorate reports and some other studies as well, like Alison Liebling's study there, for example, Imran Awan's study as well. We also found some discrimination from fellow chaplains as well. It was less direct. It was more to do with the erosion of rights over the religious and pastoral duties. There was a kind of denial of budget issues from imams who were saying we were denied budget, we're denied full-time appointments, and having keys in prison is a great privilege, although it comes with challenges as well. And there was a fear of the chapel being used for, you know, as I mentioned before, the sacred space that's being somehow diluted and impure because they're filtering out and allowing more and more people to use that space as well. I'm glad I've only given it 3 minutes, because at the end we come to Islamic radicalisation in prison. It wasn't the central focus of our previous study. It straddled 9/11. There is this contrast I mentioned at the outset between the government and the Prison Office Association, for example, the Prison Officers Association, between this conveyor belt image that people are in prison, they're vulnerable, therefore they're more susceptible to extremist interpretations, they become radicalised, or they convert to Islam, they go out and they commit atrocities. Because there have been some highlighted practices, there have been highlighted incidents where some people have come to Islam, have been radicalised and have committed some offences. But it's not something the academic research backs up at this stage, because we find that it's far more restraint. And the key studies there, perhaps Gabriel Moranchi's study, 2008, is one of the best studies of this kind that looked at over 170 individuals within and outside of prison as an anthropological study. And he also was very concerned about overstating this claim, but did have some reservation about there could be some influence. And I also think within particular prisons where there are a higher number of those in prison for terrorist-related offences, there could be an issue. But also, it doesn't reflect this institutionalisation of Islam in prison. There's high vetting that's going on now in prison in terms of what is said in the congregational prayers, who the individuals are going in, and also the kind of appointment of particular individuals as full-time Muslim chaplains. Now we have a number of full-time Muslim chaplains. But I put a question mark. Is the academic research lagging behind? Academia moves very glacially, very, very incrementally, and we also have got studies which are indicating that there are some issues in France, in Spain, for example, where the prison services do not have the ability to engage with their Muslim prisoners, and therefore that could also lead to some problems in terms of knowing what texts are being distributed, or indeed their interpretation of Islam within the prison setting. So that brings me up to time. I've run out somewhat, but I've come to Q&A, and I'm hoping I'll be able to pick up some more of those themes and the links between my other work on terms of racialization and the prison context. But I'm going to end it there so we've got a few minutes to talk and take questions.